Greetings, Father Mark signing on with the next installment in the series on medieval church history. Last time we covered the life of Cassiodorus, and today we will move into the life of Pope Gregory I, Gregory the Great. We'll certainly need more than one episode to cover his life. So, 50 years after the death of Cassiodorus, bringing us to the year 590, Gregory, son of Gordian, became the 64th pope, the first monk elected to that office. He was the first pope named Gregory, so Gregory I, and subsequently, because of his achievements to history, he is known as Gregory the Great. With Gregory, the transition to the medieval world is complete. The most noteworthy distinction is that whereas the previous guys we covered, Boethius and Cassiodorus, were so completely fluent in both Latin and Greek that they made numerous translations from one to the other. Whereas Pope Gregory's ignorance of Greek was so complete that an early assignment to Constantinople before he became Pope ended in complete failure because of his dependence on local translators who, of course, had no regard for the good of the church. So Gregory was born in the year 540 AD, during the Gothic War and during the Persian War, which we've covered previously. 6 years later, in 546, with the tide of the Gothic War turning against him, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, out of desperation, resorted to the Foederati strategy against the Goths. He invited ethnically Scandinavian Longobards into Pannonia to become Foederati under their chief Audoin. So that's present-day Hungary, north of the Save River. Naturally, Audoin began calling himself Rex, or King of the Longobards. This tribe's name, Longobard, was not euphonic to the Latin ear, so it was euphanized into Lombard. Lombards figured so prominently in the subsequent history of Italy that part of northern Italy is still called Lombardy, with the largest city being Milan. 7 years later, in the year 553, when Gregory was age 13, the Second Council of Constantinople met for 8 sessions, from the 5th of May through the 2nd of June, 553, attended by 165 bishops. 14 of them were Latin. At this council, Nestorianism was condemned again. Nestorian, name for a guy, Nestorius. He was from Syria originally, but then became Bishop of Constantinople, and in that position he promulgated yet another version of dualism. He asserted that Mary, the Blessed Mother, was the mother of the human Jesus, but not the divine Christ. So not only is that stupid, but it's heretical, so it was quite properly condemned. This council also condemned monophysitism, which is another version of dualism, but the exact opposite of Nestorianism. So Nestorius denied the divinity of Christ, whereas the Monophysites, on the other hand, denied the humanity of Christ. Remember the first lecture I told you, that dualism, it's like theological fungus. It never goes away. 2 years later, 555, when Gregory was age 15, the Lombard Foederati followed the well-trodden path of betrayal paved by their forebears. When they achieved success fighting the Ostrogoths in Italy on behalf of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, they, instead of turning the territory over to Justinian, they simply kept it for themselves. 3 years later, in 558, on the island of Ireland, or Hibernia, as the Romans would have called it, two events took place that proved to be, in the long run, far more successful than Justinian at dealing with the successor kingdoms of the Foederati and their descendants. 2 Pachomian monasteries were established in Ireland. Pachomian monasteries are community monasteries. The first, the Abbey at Bangor in what is now Northern Ireland in County Down, was established by St. Comgall. Second, the Abbey of Clonard was established by a friend of his, St. Finian, on the River Boyne in County Meath, near what is now the border between Northern and Southern Ireland. This was a century after St. Patrick was sent as a missionary bishop to Ireland. And that was, he was there from 432 to 462. The importance of these two abbeys, Bangor and Clonard, was that they trained generations of Irish monks who became missionaries, first to Scotland, then to England, then to continental Europe. Their spiritual sons figured prominently in converting the successor kingdoms of the West to Catholicism. Without their contribution, the Middle Ages as the age of faith either would not have been possible or certainly would have looked very different. 7 years later, in the year 565, the Emperor Justinian I died. All of his dreams in ruins. The Gothic War proved to be a catastrophic failure, which depleted his military resources and wrecked the Byzantine economy, without achieving the objective of reuniting the empire. His former Foederati Lombards celebrated his death by creating a kingdom for themselves in northern Italy, with the capital at Pavia, south of Milan. This Lombard kingdom in northern Italy endured for 2 centuries, more often than not as a bane to the papacy. For a time, the Byzantine Greeks retained a base at Ravenna in northeast Italy. It was a port, so they could support it with their navy, and it was too well fortified on the land side for the Lombard bandit tactics to overcome. In the aftermath of the Gothic Wars, disease became endemic in Italy, cholera, malaria. The population of Rome fell to less than 50,000. And that was from what it had in the imperial period had been over 1 million. 10 years later, 575, another ethnic group enters into Western records, which had long-term influence in church history, and their descendants are still in Europe. In 575, the first of a new ethnic group, the Slavs, moved in to south of present-day Austria. These were ethnically distinct from the Germans, the Scandinavians, or Asiatics. They had a distinctive language and culture that has been traced to the area that is now Ukraine, Belarus, and north of the Black Sea. Despite the similar sound, the term Slav has nothing to do with slave. It's the Greek rendering of the first tribe that the Greeks encountered who spoke this language. There was a new language. It sounded to the Greek ear like sklabinoi. And then, so that became Slavonoi. Then that contracted to Slavenoi as the continents drifted. And then that contracted to Slav, so Slavonoi to Slav. By moving into Southeast Europe, this first group of Slavs, the Slovenes, called their new home Kranjska. At the time, they were pagan. Their conversion, the conversion of the Slavic people, would wait for 3 centuries until Saints Cyril and Methodius. They were ordained bishops together in 869. And then they went to the area that's now Czechoslovakia, Moravia, Poland, and began the conversion of the Slavic peoples. But the first group appeared in 575. 5 years later, in 580, a saint named Columban embarked on a missionary enterprise from Ireland to continental Europe. Born in County Meath, Ireland, Columban found his way to the Abbey of Bangor, already mentioned, where St. Comgall became his spiritual father. After 10 years at Bangor, he left with 12 companions, the most famous of which was St. Gall, Gall. They ended up in a kingdom that at the time was called Burgundy, that encompassed what is now Switzerland and the eastern region of present-day France. Because of intermarriages among the tribal rulers of these successor kingdoms, the king of Burgundy at the time, a guy named Guntram, was the grandson of Clovis the Frank, king of France, from 481 to 511. Clovis was baptized Catholic in 508. Therefore, Guntram, as his grandson, was also Catholic. So he welcomed this group of monks and granted them use of an abandoned Gallo-Roman fort at Onegray in the Vosges Mountains. That's in northeastern France. These monks turned a crumbling Roman fort into a thriving community that grew their own food, reared their own herds of animals. Columban attracted followers among the Burgundian population, consisting of now were 3rd and 4th generation transplanted Scandinavians, some of whom were the product of intermarriage between the original Federati or their descendants with the indigenous, with the descendants of the Imperials, the old Gallo-Romans. 10 years later, in 590, the numbers of monks at Onegray were too great to maintain a stable community. So King Guntram gave to Columban another abandoned Roman fort 8 miles away at Luzio. Another followed at Fontaine. It was there that Columban composed his regula, his rule for monks. It was a 10-chapter rule that was exceptional by its severity compared to the balance of Benedict's rule. For example, Columban in his rule stipulated flogging as a punishment for even minor offenses. Yet Columban's success and the distinctive Celtic practices he encouraged brought him to the attention of the existing Gallo-Roman hierarchy. They chose to regard him as a threat, as an outsider, this Irish outsider coming in to disturb things. They, and with this, Satan intervened. So Columban was doing good for the church. Therefore, a satanic attack was inevitable. They used the different Easter computation as the basis for attack. Columban stated that he had known of no other way to do it, because in Ireland they use the Eastern way. They use the different method for calculating the equinox, and then based on the equinox, that's how you calculate Easter. Letters were exchanged. Anyway, a lot happened, and he ended up leaving. Just to shorten the story, he ended up moving on. His monasteries remained, which means it was obvious that it was just him that these guys that didn't like. So he moved on. He moved into Italy. And in Italy, he went to Pavia, the capital of the Lombard kingdom. And there he received a welcome because of a lady we're going to talk about, well, maybe not in this session, but in a future session, because Pope Gregory corresponded with her, because of another intermarriage that it facilitated the conversion of the Lombards, starting from the top down. So she was there. She was regent at the time, and then her son was a Catholic. So they gave Columban a monastery at Bobbio, which is still there, and became a center of learning during the medieval period. And he died there. Actually, his tomb is still there at Bobbio. He died there at Bobbio on November 21st, 615. Pope Benedict XVI summarized Columban's contributions in the following words, quote, "The holy abbot Columban, the best-known Irishman of the early Middle Ages, since he worked as a monk, missionary, and writer in various countries of Western Europe, with good reason he can be called a European saint. With the Irish of his time, he had a sense of Europe's cultural unity. The expression totius Europae, of all Europe, with reference to the Church's presence on the continent, is found for the first time in one of his letters, written around the year 600, addressed to Pope Gregory the Great." And this was about the Easter thing. St. Columban's message is concentrated in a firm appeal to conversion and detachment from earthly goods, with a view to the eternal inheritance. With his ascetic life and conduct free from compromises when he faced the corruption of the powerful, he is reminiscent of the severe figure of St. John the Baptist. His austerity, however, was never an end in itself, but merely the means with which to open himself freely to God's love and to correspond with his whole being to the gifts received from God, thereby restoring in himself the image of God, while at the same time cultivating the earth and renewing human society. I quote from his instructions: "If man makes correct use of those faculties that God has conceded to his soul, he will be likened to God. Let us remember that we must restore to him all those things which he deposited in us when we were in our original condition. He has taught us the way with his commandments. The first of them tells us to love the Lord with all your heart, because he loved us first. From the beginning of time, even before we came into the light of the world, he loved us." Back to Benedict. The Irish saint truly incarnated these words in his own life. A man of great culture, he also wrote poetry in Latin and a grammar book. He proved rich in gifts of grace. He was a tireless builder of monasteries, as well as an intransigent penitential preacher who spent every ounce of his energy on nurturing the Christian roots of Europe, which was coming into existence. With his spiritual energy, with his faith, with his love for God and neighbor, he truly became one of the fathers of Europe. He shows us even today the roots from which our Europe can be reborn. Columban embarked on his missionary endeavor in the year 580. 9 years later, on May 4th, 589, the church successfully converted the Visigoths to Catholicism. So we'll pick up with that next time. This all occurred during the lifetime of Pope Gregory. So the next one will be Gregory B, lecture B of Gregory. So anyway, for now, this session is adjourned. Stay tuned for the next one, but thank you for your attention, and this session is adjourned.